In a quiet Idaho town, a worker stepped into a tank and never walked out the same. Cyanide filled his lungs, greed sealed his fate, and a courtroom would decide whether one man's arrogance was a crime against a single life or against us all. The August sun rose over Soda Springs, Idaho, casting long shadows across a landscape both beautiful and scarred. To an outsider, this quiet corner of the Bear River Valley looked like a peaceful rural town. Neat houses, a cafe serving pork chops and pie, pickup trucks parked outside the feed store. But just beyond the edges of Main Street lay a different world, one carved out by industry. Looming stacks, chemical ponds, mountains of waste rock, and the pungent smell of processing plants that had dominated life here for decades. For generations, phosphate had been the lifeblood of this community. It promised jobs, wages, and a steady rhythm of work that bound families to the land. Yet the very industry that sustained Soda Springs also brought with it an invisible danger, a danger few outside the plants truly understood. Among those who did not yet grasp its full cost was a 20-year-old named Scott Dominguez. Scott was lean, wiry, and eager to carve out a future. Raised in a working-class family, he had big plans: to marry his fiancée, Theresa, to build something better than the small-town grind that kept so many of his peers tied down. He dreamed of college, of stability, of proving himself. But like most young men in Soda Springs, he knew that meant working where the money was. The plants north of town. Kermagee, Monsanto, Soda Springs Phosphate. All of them employed locals, all of them tough places to work, but steady. Scott's path, though, would lead him not to one of the established corporations but to a rundown operation with peeling paint, rusting tanks, and an owner who promised opportunity while cutting corners at every turn. The company was called Evergreen Resources, and its boss was a man named Allan Elias. Elias was imposing, physically and otherwise. A man over 6 feet tall with a barrel chest, a quick temper, and a history of failed business ventures. He carried himself as someone who refused to be questioned. Employees learned quickly. When Allan gave an order, you followed it. Safety concerns, regulations, procedures, those were luxuries. What mattered was speed, cutting costs, and getting the job done, no matter the risks. On the morning of August 27, 1996, Scott told Theresa something he had never said before. "I'm afraid to go to work today." She tried to shake it off, but his words lingered. He had been sick the night before after climbing into one of the company's massive storage tanks. His throat burned, his chest felt heavy. Whatever was inside that tank was no ordinary sludge. Still, he pushed the fear aside. He needed the paycheck. He needed to prove himself. By mid-morning, Scott was perched on top of the tank again, lowering a ladder into the darkness below. The tank was supposed to be cleared of waste so Elias could use it for sulfuric acid storage. Inside, the residue clung like clay, choking the drains, resisting the force of water hoses. To make matters worse, the men had been ordered inside without the respirators, air blowers, or protective suits that regulations demanded. When Scott asked about safety gear, Elias snapped back with his usual dismissive rage. "There's nothing in there but mud and water. Safe as shampoo." It wasn't. Within an hour, fumes filled the confined space. Workers outside the tank heard coughing, then shouts. Inside, Scott struggled for breath. His partner managed to climb out, but Scott collapsed into the rising sludge. His eyes rolled back, his body convulsed, and within minutes, he was unresponsive. Panic rippled across the plant. Co-workers scrambled to save him, but each man who went in was overcome. The fumes were invisible but lethal. Some described the smell faint, bitter almonds. To seasoned rescuers, it was unmistakable. Cyanide. The call went out. Local firefighters, paramedics, state troopers, and eventually federal investigators descended on Evergreen Resources. What they encountered was chaos. Men staggering, some barely conscious, a tank that reeked of chemicals, and an owner pacing angrily, more concerned with appearances than the dying young man still trapped inside. By the time Scott was pulled from the tank, the damage was done. His lungs were scorched, his brain deprived of oxygen. He survived, but barely. The vibrant young man who had walked into work that morning would never walk, talk, or live independently again. His life had been shattered, and with it, the illusion that environmental crimes were just regulatory issues. This was no accident. It was a preventable tragedy, the result of greed, arrogance, and disregard for human life. And it would ignite a legal battle unlike anything Idaho had ever seen. One that would test the limits of environmental law, pit small-town workers against powerful lawyers, and force America to reckon with a chilling question. How much is a human life worth when weighed against the profits of industry? The story of Scott Dominguez and Allan Elias is more than a tale of one company, one tank, one terrible day. It is about the hidden costs of looking the other way, about regulators too often ignored and laws too rarely enforced. And it is about courage, the courage of a young man who endured the unendurable, and of those who refused to let his suffering be dismissed as just another workplace mishap. This is that story, and it begins not in a courtroom, but in the suffocating darkness of a tank in Soda Springs, Idaho, where a canary named Scott Dominguez became the warning sign no one wanted to hear. The tank loomed over the yard like a rusted tomb, its rounded sides streaked with years of neglect. To Scott, perched high above the opening, it must have felt like looking into the mouth of something alive, black, damp, and waiting. He lowered the ladder and felt the rungs vanish into shadow. Around him, evergreen resources stretched like a graveyard of broken industry. Twisted pipes, discarded rail cars, piles of mining waste in unnatural colors. One black as coal, the other chalk white. This wasn't a polished operation humming with efficiency. It was a patchwork kingdom held together by shortcuts and intimidation, ruled by a man who thought himself untouchable. That man, Allan Elias, had built his reputation not on integrity but on audacity. Born into wealth back east, the son of a garment industry owner, Elias had drifted west chasing ventures that collapsed one after another. Silver extraction in Pocatello, fertilizer in Soda Springs, each new plan came with big promises, but the same pattern repeated. Cut costs, ignore rules, and leave others to pay the price. To locals, Elias was a paradox. A man who flaunted his ambition but left behind rusting equipment, unpaid debts, and angry workers. For young men like Scott, though, the choice was limited. In Soda Springs, work meant risk. Acid burns, toxic dust, the ever-present danger of machinery. Everyone knew the hazards. But at Evergreen, the risks weren't just tolerated, they were enforced. Speak up about safety and you were labeled lazy. Refuse a dangerous order and you'd find yourself without a job. For a 20-year-old with bills to pay and a wedding to plan, that wasn't an option. So Scott climbed. Inside the tank, the air was heavy, thick with humidity and fumes that clung to the back of his throat. He and fellow worker Darren Weaver tried to break apart the stubborn sludge, their boots sinking in the muck as water from the hose mixed with chemical residue. Each breath came harder. The masks they'd been given, relics from another era, offered no protection, trapping the vapors instead of filtering them. Soon they abandoned them altogether. Outside, older workers like Brian Smith shook their heads. They'd seen enough to know this was wrong. They should be in full gear, Smith had argued earlier that morning. Rubber suits, air packs, blowers to vent the tank. He'd mentioned the permit too, the one required by law for confined space entry. Elias brushed it off with a sneer. It's just mud and water, safer than shampoo. But the truth was far more sinister. This wasn't harmless sludge. The tank had a history. Before arriving at Evergreen, it had been used to store toxic byproducts from a failed silver recovery operation. Chemicals including cyanide compounds had seeped into its walls, lingering like ghosts. When water and acid mixed with the residue, it released fumes invisible to the eye but devastating to the body. Minutes inside felt like hours. Sweat poured, muscles burned, and then the dizziness set in. Weaver climbed toward the light, gasping. Behind him, Scott wavered, eyes unfocused. "I can't breathe," he whispered, and collapsed into the sludge. Panic erupted. Weaver screamed for help. Smith dropped his equipment and rushed to the tank, lowering himself inside in a desperate attempt to drag Scott out. But within moments, the same choking sensation overtook him. His chest heaved, his head spun, and the bitter almond stench filled his lungs. Cyanide. He knew the signs. If he stayed, both he and Scott would die. With a final grip on Scott's shoulders, he whispered, "Hold on, I'll get help," before staggering back up the ladder, barely conscious. Above ground, chaos spread like fire. Workers shouted, running in every direction. Someone dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice on the other end struggled to make sense of it. A man down in a tank, possible chemicals, others collapsing. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them. Men stumbling like drunks, their faces pale, their breaths ragged. A tank that hissed with unseen menace. And at the center of it all, the body of Scott Dominguez still trapped inside, his life slipping away with each poisoned breath. Caribou County volunteer firefighters, unaccustomed to such industrial emergencies, scrambled to set up rescue gear. Their training told them the truth. 60% of confined space fatalities are rescuers themselves. Entering without proper gear would be suicide. Yet time was vanishing. Each minute inside meant more irreversible damage to Scott's brain and lungs. The rescuers argued over options. Cut the tank open with a torch? Without knowing what chemicals were inside, it could trigger an explosion. Use harnesses and air packs. The opening was too narrow. Even trained EMTs couldn't squeeze through. Every solution carried the weight of risk not just for Scott, but for everyone on site. As sirens wailed and dust clouds rose from arriving ambulances, the tension sharpened. Workers shouted conflicting advice. Some begged rescuers to hurry. Others insisted nothing could be done. And there, pacing with a mix of fury and denial, was Allan Elias. Witnesses later recalled how he demanded explanations, deflected blame, even blocked doorways. More consumed with control than with the fate of the young man whose life was ebbing away in the tank. Finally, after frantic maneuvering, firefighters cut into the steel. Sparks flew, smoke rose, and the tank groaned as a new opening gave rescuers a way in. They pulled Scott out, limp and unresponsive. His body convulsed with seizures. Foam spilled from his mouth. His lungs, scarred by cyanide, gasped weakly for air that could no longer sustain him. By the time he reached the hospital, doctors knew the prognosis was grim. Scott had survived, but the poison had left its mark. His brain, deprived of oxygen, would never fully recover. He was 20 years old, and his life as he knew it was gone. For the people of Soda Springs, the incident was both shocking and strangely familiar. Everyone knew the dangers of working in the phosphate industry, but this was different. This wasn't a tragic accident or a miner's misstep. This was negligence, plain and brutal. A young man had been ordered into a death trap without the most basic protections. And those responsible were not faceless corporations hundreds of miles away. They were right there in town walking free. For federal investigators, the call from Idaho was another matter altogether. To them, this wasn't just workplace negligence. This was a potential environmental crime, one of the rare cases where pollution and profit collided so directly with human life. And it would fall to a small team of agents and prosecutors to prove something few courts had ever recognized. That sending a man into a poison tank wasn't just reckless, it was criminal. The stage was set. A young man lay in a hospital bed, his future stolen. A community whispered of corruption and fear. And a legal system, long hesitant to treat environmental violations as anything more than paperwork infractions, would be forced to decide whether justice had a place in a story like this. Long before that August morning, the people closest to Scott Dominguez knew him as more than just another name on a payroll sheet. To his fiancée, Theresa, he was the boy who made her laugh with effortless charm, who could turn a dull evening in their small apartment into something memorable with a joke, a smile, or just the way he looked at her. They were young, barely starting out, and their plans were modest but full of hope. Save enough for a wedding, maybe put money toward college, build a life that wasn't defined by endless shifts in dangerous plants. Scott was known for his wiry energy. He had been a wrestler in high school, quick on his feet, lean but strong. Friends remembered how he could keep a hacky sack bouncing for minutes on end, grinning as the little circle of guys around him tried to match his skill. He wasn't the type to complain. In fact, Theresa had been startled that morning when he admitted he was afraid to go to work. For him to say that meant something deep inside was unsettled. At Evergreen, however, fear was rarely spoken aloud. Workers had seen things go wrong before. Tanks leaking, hoses breaking, men sprayed with acid that ate holes through their clothes before they could tear them off. Evergreen didn't have the safety infrastructure of the larger companies in town. There were no emergency showers lined up for burns, no routine drills, no real protective gear. Most of what passed for equipment was scavenged, outdated, or borrowed. The message was clear. If you wanted a paycheck, you did what you were told. Allan Elias was not a man who invited debate. When employees questioned him about respirators, he ridiculed them. When someone mentioned permits, he dismissed it. Regulations were, to him, a nuisance invented by bureaucrats, obstacles in the way of turning waste into profit. The truth was, Elias had long been on the radar of regulators. Years earlier, in Pocatello, his silver recovery venture had collapsed under a cloud of suspicion. Chemicals, including cyanide salts, were purchased and handled with reckless disregard. When that business failed, much of the equipment and residue, including the tank Scott was ordered into, followed him to Soda Springs. What had once been a vessel for hazardous chemicals was now rebranded as a simple storage tank. But chemicals don't care about paperwork. Cyanide embedded in rusting steel remains cyanide. On that August morning, the hidden danger revealed itself. And once Scott collapsed, the consequences rippled outward in waves. When rescuers finally pulled him from the tank, his body convulsed with seizures. Witnesses described foam bubbling from his mouth and nose. His eyes rolled back, unseeing. Paramedics rushed to stabilize him, but the damage was already catastrophic. Cyanide doesn't just choke the lungs. It strangles cells at their very core, preventing the body from using oxygen even when it's present. Organs suffocate. The brain starves. Survival is rare. As the ambulance sped toward Bannock Regional Medical Center in Pocatello, Scott's fiancée Theresa was still at work at a local deli, unaware that her life had just been torn in two. A friend burst through the doors, panic written on her face, and the words tumbled out. "It's Scott. He's down. He's not breathing." Theresa dropped everything. In that instant, the wedding ring she hoped for, the college fund they dreamed of, the life they were building, all of it hung by a thread. At the hospital, doctors and nurses fought to keep Scott alive. Tubes were inserted, machines beeped, IVs dripped. They knew cyanide poisoning when they saw it, the seizures, the foaming lungs, the smell some described as bitter almonds. Treatments were limited. Antidotes existed, but the timing was critical, and Scott had been down too long. When Theresa arrived, she found not the strong young man she'd kissed goodbye that morning, but a figure almost unrecognizable. His body racked, his breathing labored, his future uncertain. She held his hand, whispering his name, as if her voice could pull him back from the edge. Meanwhile, back at Evergreen, the questions were already beginning. Local police, state officials, and eventually federal agents would piece together what had happened. They would hear stories of workers begging for respirators, of Elias dismissing safety as a nuisance, of cyanide compounds lurking in the sludge. And they would realize this was no simple accident. This was a test case, one that would force the law to decide whether knowingly sending a man into a lethal tank could be prosecuted not just as negligence, but as a crime. But for now, in those first harrowing hours, all that mattered was whether Scott would live through the night. The young man who only hours before had been full of plans and promise now lay silent in a hospital bed. His future in the hands of doctors and destiny. His family gathered. His fiancée prayed. And in Soda Springs, whispers spread like wildfire. What really happened at Evergreen? Who was to blame? And would anyone be held accountable? The answers would not come quickly. They would take years of investigation, legal battles, and courtroom drama. But they all began with that one morning, August 27, 1996, when a young man climbed into a tank and became the Cyanide Canary of Soda Springs. Soda Springs had always been a town shaped by what lay beneath its soil. Long before phosphate became its fortune, Pioneers along the Oregon Trail stopped here to rest their animals and drink from the carbonated mineral springs that bubbled up from the earth. The waters were strange, tasting like soda water, fizzing with volcanic gases, but they brought relief after miles of dust and thirst. By the late 1800s, prospectors discovered something more valuable: enormous beds of phosphate, remnants of an ancient sea that had once covered the region. By the 20th century, phosphate was king. It was turned into fertilizer, detergents, even matches and fire retardants. For Soda Springs, it meant jobs. The skyline filled with smokestacks and conveyor belts. The air thickened with chemical haze, and generations of men traded their health for steady paychecks. By the 1990s, the industry employed nearly half the town's workforce. Wages were decent. Families could buy homes, trucks, send their kids to school. But everyone knew the risks. Burns, accidents, toxic exposure. They were the unspoken cost of keeping the town alive. It was into this world that Allan Elias arrived. Elias wasn't a local. He came from money back east, but he carried himself like a man determined to dominate whatever room he entered. In Pocatello, he had tried his hand at extracting silver from mining waste, but the venture collapsed under debt and suspicion. Chemicals were mishandled, safety ignored. When that business failed, he shifted south to Soda Springs, gathering equipment, workers, and whatever contracts he could scrape together. Evergreen Resources was born from that ambition. On paper, it looked promising, a company that could take the mountains of waste left behind by larger plants and process them into usable fertilizer. If Elias succeeded, perhaps one of the big players would buy him out. He told his workers this repeatedly. Stick with him, help him get Evergreen running, and they'd have their pick of stable jobs at Kerr-McGee or Monsanto. But the reality was harsher. Evergreen wasn't a streamlined operation. It was a patchwork yard of rusting tanks, scavenged equipment, and half-built projects. Safety gear was scarce, record-keeping spotty, and procedures almost non-existent. Workers were young and expendable. They were told to improvise, to make do, to get the job done no matter what. For a man like Scott Dominguez, barely 20, Evergreen represented both opportunity and danger. He didn't have the resume to land a position at Kerr-McGee, but Elias was willing to hire him, and that mattered. 2 years into the job, Scott had proven himself loyal, hardworking, and willing to do whatever was asked. He hoped it would pay off. Instead, it nearly killed him. On August 27, 1996, when Scott fell unconscious inside the tank, Evergreen's reputation shifted from just another rough plant to the center of a nightmare. Workers scrambled. Neighbors looked on from across the tracks. Firefighters risked their own lives to cut through steel and drag him out. In town, sirens wailed as the ambulance sped toward the hospital. The ripple effects were immediate. At the Caribou County Volunteer Firehouse, pagers buzzed with the chilling message, "Man down in a tank at Evergreen." Some of the men had wives who worked at local businesses, kids in the high school, cousins employed at the plants. They knew the names of the workers, sometimes their families. This wasn't a distant emergency. It was personal. At the Quick Stop Deli, Theresa dropped her rag and stood frozen as a friend burst in with the news. She raced to the hospital, her mind spinning, refusing to believe the worst. And across town, people whispered. Evergreen had always been a dangerous place. Elias was known for his temper, for cutting corners, for insisting things were safe when everyone suspected otherwise. Now a young man was fighting for his life, and the whole valley buzzed with questions. Had this finally gone too far? Would Elias be held accountable? Or would this be just another incident swept under the rug? At the hospital, doctors knew the odds. Cyanide is one of the most lethal industrial toxins. It doesn't simply suffocate like smoke or gas. It hijacks the body at the cellular level, shutting down the very process of oxygen use. Antidotes existed, hydroxycobalamin, sodium thiosulfate, but their effectiveness depended on speed. For Scott, precious minutes had already been lost inside the tank. He survived the night, but the prognosis was devastating. His lungs were ravaged, his brain damaged. He would never again be the same. Back at Evergreen, investigators began arriving. Local police, OSHA compliance officers, and eventually federal agents. What they found was chaos. No safety permits, no protective gear, conflicting accounts from workers, and an owner who dodged every question. Elias claimed it was nothing but mud and water. Yet the bitter almond stench, the convulsing body of a young man, and the testimonies of workers told another story. For investigators, this case would become more than just a workplace accident. It would become a landmark prosecution, testing whether environmental laws, so often treated as paperwork violations, could truly deliver justice for a human life. But in that first week, before the lawsuits and indictments, before the federal prosecutors and courtroom drama, the story was simpler and more heartbreaking. A young man with dreams of marriage and college, now trapped in a hospital bed. A family praying for a miracle. A fiancé holding his hand, whispering his name, and a town coming to terms with the fact that the dangers it had long tolerated had finally consumed one of its own. The canary in the coal mine had fallen. And unlike the miners of old, who carried their fragile birds into the earth as warnings, Soda Springs had no cage, no oxygen tank, no way to revive its human canary. Scott Dominguez had become the living symbol of what happens when profit outweighs safety, when arrogance eclipses compassion, and when the warnings are ignored until it's too late. Back at Evergreen, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. Sirens wailed as volunteer fire trucks, ambulances, and police cruisers rolled down the dusty road. Workers stumbled in the yard, coughing, their eyes red and watering. 2 men collapsed outright, unable to stay on their feet. The air smelled of chemicals, acrid and strange, with that faint, telltale note some described as burnt almonds. On top of the tank, firefighters crouched, peering into the black opening. Inside, they could see the faint outline of Scott Dominguez, slumped and unmoving. He looked impossibly small against the curved walls of steel. Every second mattered, but every option carried risk. The tank was narrow, the entry hatch barely wide enough for a wiry worker, let alone a fully suited rescuer with an air pack. Removing protective gear was unthinkable. 60% of confined space fatalities weren't the original victims, but the would-be rescuers. The men knew it. Some hesitated. Others clenched their fists, ready to try anyway. It fell to Darren Schwartz, a fire chief from nearby Monsanto, to take command. He sized up the situation, scanning the yard. Panicked workers, angry supervisors, and a growing crowd of onlookers gathering along the railroad tracks. He shouted orders to clear space, to bring up equipment, to keep everyone back. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a scene teetering on the edge of disaster. Meanwhile, Elias prowled. Witnesses recalled him shouting questions, demanding explanations, even blocking men in doorways. His face flushed, his eyes bulging. He radiated more fury than fear. To those watching, it was clear he wasn't worried about Scott. He was worried about himself, about liability, about losing control of the story before it even began. The rescuers argued over methods. Cut the tank with a torch? What if the fumes ignited? Lower a harness? The boy wasn't moving, and the rope might tangle. Send someone in? The last worker to try barely made it out alive. Finally, sparks flew as they cut into the steel. The torch hissed, showering the yard with fragments of glowing metal. Men held hoses at the ready, spraying to cool the edges, their boots slipping in the toxic sludge that had leaked out. When the hole widened enough, they slipped inside, strapped Scott to a backboard, and passed him back through the jagged opening. The sight was seared into memory. His limp body coated in slime, his chest rising in erratic spasms, foam spilling from his mouth. His hands twitched, his eyes rolled back. He looked less like a living man than a marionette jerked by unseen strings. Paramedics swarmed, working quickly, oxygen masks, for lines, antidotes administered in desperate hope. His body convulsed, his heart faltered, but somehow he clung to a flicker of life. The ambulance tore down the county roads, dust trailing behind it as sirens screamed. Inside, Scott's future was hanging by a thread. Back at the plant, the responders took stock. The tank was a death trap, no permit, no ventilation, no safety equipment. The yard was littered with rusting rail cars, leaking pipes, and piles of waste that no one could fully identify. To the trained eye, it wasn't just a workplace accident. It was a powder keg, waiting to explode again. By the time the last fire truck pulled away, the question lingered in the hot Idaho air. What had really happened in that tank? In town, rumors spread faster than the sirens had traveled. Parents warned their kids about Evergreen. Workers whispered in bars about cyanide. Families shook their heads, saying they'd always known that plant would kill someone. At the hospital, Scott's mother and stepfather arrived, devastated by the sight of their son tethered to machines. Theresa sat at his side, gripping his hand, whispering promises he might never hear. Doctors stabilized him, but the prognosis was grim. The cyanide had stolen too much. Even if he lived, he would never walk into work again, never play hacky sack with his friends, never kneel to propose to Theresa the way he had once dreamed. In a sense, Soda Springs had lost him that day, even though his heart still beat. And yet, his story was only beginning, because what happened inside that tank would not stay buried in the rubble of Evergreen Resources. It would reach courtrooms, headlines, and even the halls of federal power. It would become a test case for how America treated environmental crime, not as a paperwork violation, not as a fine to be paid, but as something that could destroy lives, families, and futures. Scott Dominguez, a 20-year-old with a wedding on the horizon, had become the warning sign no one could ignore. He was the canary, and this time the mine wasn't made of coal. It was made of cyanide. The call came in on a late summer evening, just as the sky over Seattle turned gold. EPA Special Agent Joe Hildorfer was at home, trying to unwind. He and his wife were finishing dinner on the back patio, the Puget Sound breeze carrying the last warmth of the day. But even over a glass of Chardonnay, his mind drifted to the case that still gnawed at him. Boom snub chrome and grind. He had spent years building that investigation. The company had dumped toxic chromium waste into the soil, poisoned groundwater, and lied to regulators. He and his partner had uncovered the truth, gathered evidence, put their hearts into the case. But in court, the judge had dismissed the charges as little more than a traffic violation. The company paid a fine. No one went to prison. For Joe, a former FBI agent who had joined the EPA's fledgling Criminal Investigation Division, it was disheartening. Environmental crimes don't put people in jail, colleagues would whisper. They just get probation, maybe a fine. And deep down, he wondered if they were right. That night, as he tried to push the bitterness aside, the phone rang. On the other end was Dixon McClary, his boss in EPA's Region 10. Joe, you remember a place in Idaho called Evergreen Resources? The name rang a bell. Joe had driven past it once, a rundown fertilizer operation in Soda Springs. Locals had warned him about the owner, Allan Elias, a man with a reputation for acid spills, shady dealings, and a slippery way of avoiding serious charges. Nothing had stuck. Well, McClary continued, we just got a call from the Idaho State Police. There's been an incident. Shit bubbling out of the ground from a tank. Workers were sent in without safety gear. One's in the hospital. Might not make it. Joe set his glass down. He'd heard variations of this story before. Accidents, chemical burns, workers hospitalized. But there was something in McClary's tone that told him this was different. They're saying cyanide, McClary added quietly. Cyanide. A word that stopped even seasoned investigators in their tracks. Not just toxic, but lethal. Colorless, invisible, capable of killing in seconds. The very mention of it conjured images of poisonings, espionage, even executions. But here, it wasn't a spy novel. It was a fertilizer plant in rural Idaho, and a 20-year-old kid was fighting for his life. McClary didn't waste time. I'm sending Kelly O'Neill from Oregon. I want you and Bob Wojnik's on the next flight out. DQ, OSHA, Hazmat, they're already on the ground. This could be big, Joe. Real big. Joe hung up and sat back, staring at the horizon. The golden light had faded to gray. He thought of the young man in the hospital bed, faceless for now but real enough. He thought of Elias, the slippery plant owner who always managed to sidestep accountability. And he thought of Boomsnub, of the bitter lesson that environmental crimes rarely carried real punishment. But maybe, just maybe, this was different. The next morning, the investigation began. Soda Springs was no stranger to chemicals. Everyone in town knew the acrid tang in the air, the piles of waste rock stacked like unnatural mountains, the ever-present hum of industrial plants. But what the agents saw at Evergreen was beyond neglect. The yard was a junkyard. Rusting tanks, cut-up rail cars, twisted metal, and puddles of water tinted strange blue-green colors. The storage tank where Scott Dominguez had collapsed was stained with sludge, its concrete supports already crumbling from acid leaks. Workers admitted they had been ordered inside without respirators or protective suits. One man had flatly refused. Another had gone in and barely made it out alive. And the owner? Elias insisted it was harmless. Just mud and water, no different than shampoo. But Joe had heard the same from polluters before. It was always harmless. It was always just a mistake. And yet here was a young man on life support, his body wrecked by invisible fumes. EPA agents walked the site, snapping photos, collecting samples, interviewing workers. OSHA compliance officers arrived too, pressing Elias for confined space permits, respirator logs, chemical inventories. He had none. In those early hours, the case was still uncertain. Was this negligence? Was it reckless endangerment? Or was it something far darker? A deliberate violation of law that had nearly killed a man? Joe Hildorfer knew one thing. It wouldn't be easy. Environmental crime cases never were. Companies hired lawyers. Defendants claimed ignorance. Regulators argued over jurisdiction. And juries, more often than not, saw it as just a workplace accident. But this time, Joe felt something different. This wasn't just about groundwater or emissions or paperwork violations. This was about a human being. As he left the site, he glanced back at the rusting tank. Stood silent now, but to him it looked like a crime scene. A steel coffin that had almost claimed a young man's life. The fight ahead would be long. But Joe was ready. By the time the last fire engine pulled away from Evergreen, a new wave of officials had already begun to arrive. The sirens were quieter now, but the tension hung thick in the air. For the men and women in hard hats and government jackets, this was the beginning of a puzzle they would spend years trying to piece together. The Idaho State Police were first on scene, walking the yard with clipboards, snapping Polaroids of the tanks and the puddles that shimmered with rainbow sheens. They weren't trained chemists, but even they knew something was wrong here. Acid should not be bubbling up from the ground. Then came the OSHA compliance officers, with binders under their arms and a checklist of federal requirements. They asked for the confined space permit, the legally required document that spelled out what hazards had been tested in the tank, what respirators had been issued, who was authorized to enter. Elias waved them off. There was nothing dangerous in there, he insisted. Just mud and water. But workers told a different story. One by one, they gave their statements. Brian Smith, older and experienced, explained how he had refused to enter the tank without proper gear. He told Elias flat out, "They need full suits, SCBA's ventilation. This is dangerous." Elias dismissed him. Darren Weaver, thin and wiry, admitted he had gone in alongside Scott, trying to hose down the sludge. He recalled his chest tightening, the air getting heavier, the moment Scott whispered, "I can't breathe," before collapsing face first into the muck. Gene Thornock, another employee, described the desperate attempt to pull Scott out. He remembered climbing down, trying to lift him, but feeling the air sucked from his lungs. "I'm sorry, Scott," he had whispered as he scrambled back out, barely conscious. Their stories aligned on one point. They had asked for respirators. They had asked for safety. And every time Elias had said no. Elias, for his part, did what he always did, denied, deflected, and turned the blame back on his workers. He insisted the tank was harmless, that the men must have overexerted themselves, that if anyone had gotten sick it was because they hadn't followed his instructions. But to investigators, his behavior was telling. He wasn't shaken by the near death of a 20-year-old. He wasn't concerned about what fumes might have escaped. He was angry at the intrusion, angry at the questions, angry at the possibility that someone might hold him accountable. When pressed about the chemical history of the tank, he grew evasive. He claimed not to remember what it had once held. But in storage yards across town, paperwork and witnesses suggested otherwise. Cyanide compounds had been used in his earlier ventures, and residues didn't just vanish. The case file began to grow. Photographs of the rusting yard, air samples collected and sent to labs, worker statements recorded under oath, notes about Elias's outbursts and contradictions. At first, some regulators assumed this would play out like so many others. OSHA would issue citations, perhaps levy fines. DQ would push for cleanup. Elias would argue delay, maybe settle. The young man in the hospital would be chalked up as a tragic accident. But as the days stretched into weeks, a different picture emerged. Scott Dominguez had not just been injured. He had been crippled for life. His brain, starved of oxygen, left him unable to care for himself. His family was suddenly burdened with medical bills and the crushing grief of watching their son, once so vibrant, so full of plans, reduced to a shadow of who he had been. And the evidence pointed squarely at Allan Elias, not just as an inattentive boss, but as a man who had knowingly, deliberately sent workers into a tank he knew was unsafe, and who had lied when confronted. That combination, death or serious injury plus deception, was the line investigators had long been waiting for. It was the difference between a workplace citation and a federal crime. For Joe Hildorfer, arriving in Idaho with his partner Bob Wojnicks, the case felt like déjà vu. Another plant, another toxic site, another arrogant owner. But this time, there was a human face. A 20-year-old lying in a hospital bed, his life permanently destroyed. Standing in the evergreen yard, camera in hand, Joe studied the tank. Rust streaked its sides. A jagged hole cut by firefighters gaped like a wound. Sludge oozed across the dirt. It wasn't just industrial waste. It was evidence. And Joe knew, in that moment, that this case would be different. Because this time, he wasn't just investigating pollution. He was investigating a crime scene. The samples from Evergreen moved quickly through the chain of custody, packed in coolers, labeled, and shipped to labs. For investigators, the science mattered. Rumors and testimony painted a vivid picture, but juries demanded proof. At the EPA's National Enforcement Laboratory in Colorado, chemists pored over the sludge and water scraped from the tank. Their results confirmed what the first responders had suspected in their lungs. Cyanide residues, mixed with phosphoric acid, had created a lethal cocktail. The concentration levels weren't just hazardous. They were catastrophic for anyone inside without breathing gear. The conclusion was blunt. No worker should have entered that tank under any circumstances. And yet Elias had sent two, Scott Dominguez and Darren Weaver, down the ladder with nothing but a hose and an outdated mask scavenged from a rail car. The reports fed into a growing stack of documents crossing the desks of multiple agencies. OSHA compiled their violations, drafting citations for failure to provide respirators, failure to ventilate confined spaces, failure to test for oxygen levels or gases. Idaho DQ noted the leaks, the acid seeping into soil, the corroding concrete saddles. The EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, led in the field by Joe Hildorfer and Bob Wojnicks, began sketching the outlines of something far more serious: criminal negligence. The cooperation wasn't always smooth. OSHA and EPA sometimes clashed, each with different mandates, different priorities. Local law enforcement wanted to treat it like a workplace mishap. State regulators feared the political storm of shutting down one of the county's employers. But Joe kept pushing. "This isn't just about regulations," he told colleagues. "This is about a man who was nearly killed because his boss couldn't be bothered to spend a dime on safety." For Joe, it was personal. He had spent years watching environmental violators walk free, paying fines that barely dented their profits. He'd promised himself that one day, a case would come along where the line was clear, undeniable. A case where the law couldn't look away. And now, standing in Soda Springs, staring at a 20-year-old on life support, he felt that case had arrived. Meanwhile, Elias was already maneuvering. He had lawyers on speed dial, men who had defended him in past regulatory skirmishes. To them, this was a familiar script. Call it an accident, blame worker carelessness, argue that no one could have foreseen the danger. He painted himself as the victim of overzealous regulators, insisting the sludge was harmless, that he had never ordered anyone into danger. He hinted that Scott had ignored instructions, that workers had exaggerated their symptoms, that regulators were conspiring against him. It was a defense strategy as old as industry itself. Deny, deflect, delay. But this time, there was a complication Elias couldn't spin away. Scott Dominguez was still alive. Badly injured, permanently disabled, but alive. And his testimony, however limited it might one day be, hung like a shadow over everything Elias said. The prosecutors began circling. In Boise, assistant U.S. attorneys like George Brightsameter and Celeste Miller reviewed the files landing on their desks. They were used to drug cases, gun charges, fraud. Environmental crimes weren't the usual fare in Idaho's federal courts. But the facts spoke for themselves. A young man had been poisoned on the job. His boss had ignored every warning. And the tank that nearly killed him bore the chemical fingerprints of cyanide. For Brightsameter, the case carried echoes of his own family. His father had worked in OSHA, investigating workplace hazards. He knew too well the gap between regulations on paper and reality in the field. To him, this wasn't abstract. It was human. The question was whether they could prove it in court. To bring criminal charges, they would need more than negligence. They would need evidence of willful disregard. Proof that Elias had known the risks, dismissed them, and sent Scott inside anyway. The worker testimonies were strong. The scientific evidence was damning. Elias's own behavior, angry, evasive, combative, only strengthened the narrative. But still, they knew what they were up against. A wealthy defendant, skilled defense attorneys, and a legal system reluctant to treat environmental crimes as serious felonies. In the weeks after the accident, Soda Springs settled into a tense rhythm. The Evergreen Yard sat quiet, its tank scarred by the jagged rescue cut, yellow tape strung around its perimeter. Workers whispered about job security. Families prayed for Scott. Regulators filed their reports. But for the men building the federal case, the quiet was deceptive. Behind the scenes, they were gathering momentum piece by piece, building toward a confrontation that would test not just the strength of the law, but the very idea that poisoning a worker with industrial waste could be treated as a crime on par with violence or fraud. For Joe Hildorfer, every page of every file was a reminder of what he had seen that first night in Soda Springs. A rusting tank, a poisoned young man, and an owner who shrugged it all away. This time, he promised himself it would be different. This time, someone was going to jail. At Portneuf Medical Center in Pocatello, the steady beep of machines replaced the sound of sirens. For Scott Dominguez, life had shrunk to a hospital bed, wires, tubes, and the muffled voices of nurses adjusting monitors. He was only 20 years old, but his body now carried the scars of something few ever survived. Cyanide poisoning. The damage was everywhere. His lungs, burned by acid vapors, gasped with each shallow breath. His brain, deprived of oxygen in those crucial minutes inside the tank, misfired in cruel bursts. Seizures racked his body, bending his limbs, clenching his jaw until doctors had to wedge and bite guards to keep him from breaking teeth. His once bright eyes fluttered with confusion, sometimes focusing, sometimes lost. Doctors tried the antidotes, tried therapy, tried prayer, but the prognosis remained grim. Cyanide did not forgive. By his bedside, Theresa Cole never left. She held his hand through the nights, whispering his name, telling him stories of the life they had planned together. A modest wedding, a home of their own, maybe children someday. Now those dreams lay shattered. When Scott's body convulsed, Theresa pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, tears streaming down her face. She knew he could hear her, somewhere beneath the seizures and sedation. And so she kept talking, hoping her voice could guide him back to the surface. For Scott's mother and stepfather, the hospital became a second home. They fielded calls from friends, church members, co-workers, all asking the same thing. Will he make it? They had no answer. Some days brought small victories, a moment of lucidity, a squeeze of the hand. Other days brought only despair. The financial strain was immediate and crushing. Medical bills mounted in the tens of thousands, and more would follow. Scott would never work again. He would never play softball with his buddies, never walk into a grocery store and clock in, never climb into a tank with his coworkers. The future had been taken from him in an instant. And yet, even as his family grappled with grief, they also carried a quiet fury. They had always known Evergreen was dangerous. Workers talked about the shortcuts, the lack of safety equipment, the way Elias barked at anyone who questioned him. But no one had believed it would come to this. A young man poisoned, his life forever stolen by the arrogance of a boss who treated his employees as disposable. For the Dominguez family, Scott wasn't just a victim. He was proof that the system had failed. In Soda Springs, the story spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, at the diner, at the high school football game, people whispered about Scott. Some said he was gone already. Others claimed he was brain dead. Rumors swirled, but the truth was painful enough. He was alive, but not the same. Friends visited, often leaving shaken. The boy they had grown up with, the one who laughed loudest, who played hacky sack in the parking lot, who always talked about marrying Theresa, now lay twisted by seizures, his future locked inside hospital walls. For some, it was a wake-up call. They looked at the smokestacks differently, at the steady paycheck that came with the steady risk. For others, it was just confirmation of what they had long suspected, that Elias's plant was a ticking time bomb. Back at Evergreen, Elias kept up his defense. He told anyone who would listen that the accident wasn't his fault. He said Scott had ignored orders, that workers were exaggerating, that the regulators were out to get him. To some, he sounded convincing, a man wronged by government overreach. To others, he sounded like what he was, a boss trying to wash his hands while his worker lay in a hospital bed. The contrast was striking. On one side of the state, a family sat in vigil, clinging to a broken young man. On the other, an owner paced his yard, worrying about fines and liability. For investigators, Scott's condition added urgency. Every day he lived was both a miracle and a tragedy, proof of survival, but also proof of irreversible harm. If he had died, Elias might have faced manslaughter charges. Instead, the case became something rarer. A chance to argue that poisoning a worker, even without a body in the morgue, was still a crime worth prison time. And for the prosecutors preparing their strategy, Scott's suffering was central. It wasn't about soil samples or chemical reports anymore. It was about a face, a name, a life. Jurors could look at Scott and see the cost of cutting corners, the human toll of greed. Theresa often said later that Scott was the canary. The miners of old had carried fragile birds into the earth to warn them of gas. If the canary died, the men fled. Scott had been the canary of Soda Springs, sacrificed not to warn others, but because his employer ignored every warning already given. The difference was that Scott lived, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. And in living, he became a symbol, a reminder that environmental crimes weren't just about rivers and soil, but about flesh, blood, and futures lost. When agents first stepped onto Evergreen's property, they thought they were investigating a single accident. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. What happened to Scott Dominguez wasn't an isolated mistake. It was the inevitable result of a pattern. A history written in acid spills, rusting tanks, and years of warnings ignored. Long before the summer of 1996, Allan Elias had earned a reputation in Soda Springs. Locals knew him as sharp-tongued, ambitious, and endlessly litigious. He had a knack for cutting deals, bending rules, and finding loopholes. He didn't run his business like a careful steward. He ran it like a gambler, always betting he could get away with more than the regulators could catch. EPA files showed a trail. In the late 1980s, inspectors cited him for hazardous waste violations. State regulators flagged him for leaking acid into soil, corroding tanks, and unpermitted waste storage. He fought back each time, not with compliance but with lawyers. He sued agencies, dragged cases through court, and buried opponents in paperwork. To some, it made him look shrewd, a small operator fending off government overreach. To others, it made him dangerous, a man who treated environmental law as a game with workers and communities as the pawns. At Evergreen, that attitude seeped into every corner. Workers described being told to improvise with broken equipment. Respirators were outdated, sometimes missing cartridges. Safety gear was scarce. Training was minimal. One employee recalled asking Elias about acid burns on his hands. Elias shrugged and told him to toughen up. Another said Elias would scoff when workers complained of fumes, telling them, "If it was really bad, you'd be dead already." In the tank where Scott collapsed, the violations piled high. There had been no hazard analysis, no entry permit, no atmospheric testing. The law was clear. A confined space containing toxic residues required ventilation, monitors, harnesses, and trained rescue crews. Evergreen had none of it. What they had instead was a boss who saw safety precautions as wasted time. As investigators pieced together Elias's history, the portrait grew darker. He wasn't simply neglectful. He was combative. Inspectors recalled confrontations where he shouted, blocked entry, or demanded they leave. Neighbors remembered lawsuits, Elias suing over property lines, over taxes, over grievances large and small. He was a man who turned every challenge into a battle, convinced he could outlast anyone. And for years it worked. Regulators would cite him, but fines went unpaid. Orders were appealed until they lost steam. Court dockets filled, only for cases to vanish in procedural fog. But this time was different. This time, the stakes weren't measured in paperwork. They were measured in seizures, in wheelchairs, in a young man's shattered life. For prosecutors, the strategy became clearer with every document pulled. To convict Elias, they would need to prove intent. Not that he wanted to harm Scott, but that he knew the dangers and chose to ignore them. His history would do much of that work for them. Every citation, every inspector's note, every prior warning showed a man who had been told, repeatedly, that his practices were dangerous. And every time he had brushed it off. That pattern was gold for a jury. It stripped away the defense of ignorance. By late fall, Assistant U.S. Attorney George Breitsameter told colleagues they had a strong case. This wasn't an accident, he said. This was predictable. And Elias made it inevitable. Elias, of course, prepared for war. He called on his attorneys, men who had pulled him out of trouble before. They began assembling their narrative. A struggling businessman persecuted by overreaching regulators. A workforce that hadn't followed instructions. A tragic accident twisted into a criminal trial. It was a script Elias had leaned on for years. And for years it had worked. But now, the difference was standing in a hospital bed in Pocatello. A young man whose body told the story no legal argument could erase. Investigators pressed on, digging into Elias's past shipments, his chemical purchases, his storage records. What they uncovered suggested something even darker. That Elias had been stockpiling waste he didn't want to pay to dispose of properly. That the tank wasn't just an old fertilizer vessel, but a dumping ground for residues that had no business being stored without permits. If true, that meant the case wasn't just about Scott. It was about a business model built on cutting costs by gambling with human life. In Soda Springs, the snow began to fall, blanketing the jagged piles of phosphogypsum waste, quieting the streets. But inside the U.S. Attorney's office, inside EPA's regional headquarters, the storm was only beginning to gather. For the first time in decades, the federal government was preparing to test a question. Could an environmental crime, one that poisoned not a river, not a forest, but a single worker, put a man in prison? The answer would hinge on the case of United States versus Allan Elias. And the prosecutors were ready to try. In the fall of 1997, the quiet streets of Boise hid a storm brewing in the federal courthouse. Behind closed doors, 12 jurors sat in a paneled room, listening to testimony that would determine whether Allan Elias, fertilizer magnate, litigator, and local power broker, would face trial not for a workplace accident, but for federal crimes. The grand jury process was unfamiliar to many in Idaho. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't even public. It was the government's chance to lay out evidence, to convince a jury there was enough to move forward with criminal charges. And in this case, the stakes were extraordinary. Prosecutors George Breitsameter and Celeste Miller laid out the story piece by piece. They began with Scott Dominguez's collapse inside the tank. The cyanide fumes, the frantic rescue, the seizures that left him crippled for life. Then they called witnesses. OSHA inspectors explained the safety laws that had been ignored. The absent confined space permits, the lack of respirators, the non-existent hazard testing. EPA agents described their sampling, showing cyanide residues at levels lethal enough to kill in minutes. Workers from Evergreen recounted how they had begged for safety gear, how Elias had waved them off, how Scott had gone down the ladder anyway. Each testimony was another brick in a wall prosecutors hoped would be unbreakable. But the jurors also heard about Elias himself, his history, his temper, his arrogance. Witnesses described past confrontations with regulators, his endless lawsuits, his insistence that rules didn't apply to him. One former worker told the jurors that Elias had laughed when asked about chemical hazards, saying, "If you're still breathing, then it ain't that bad." Another recalled Elias's words the day Scott collapsed, "It's just water in there, nothing that could hurt anyone." To prosecutors, these weren't just offhand remarks. They were evidence of willful disregard, proof that Elias wasn't ignorant. He was reckless. Defense attorneys weren't present to object, but everyone knew what was coming. Elias had hired top-tier lawyers, men who had beaten regulators before. Their playbook was clear. Argue that the case was overreach, that it belonged in civil court, not criminal. They would paint Elias as a businessman targeted by a government desperate to make an example. But first, prosecutors needed the indictment. After weeks of testimony, the grand jury returned its decision. Allan Elias would be indicted on multiple federal charges. The counts were severe. They included knowingly endangering his workers under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. One of the first times this rarely used felony provision would be tested in court. Making false statements to OSHA and EPA inspectors. Violating workplace safety standards in a way that directly led to catastrophic harm. It was a legal bombshell. For the first time in U.S. history, a plant owner faced the possibility of decades in prison for what had traditionally been treated as an accident, a civil fine, or at worst a slap on the wrist. News of the indictment rippled through Soda Springs. At the diner on Main Street, farmers argued over coffee. Some said Elias had finally gotten what he deserved, a man who had cheated the system for too long. Others muttered that it was government overreach, that businesses were always the easy target. But in the Dominguez household, the news felt like justice stirring at last. Scott couldn't celebrate. His seizures and cognitive struggles made every day a battle. But his mother, his stepfather, and Theresa, his fiancée, felt something they hadn't in months. Hope. For once, it seemed Elias might not slip away. The defense moved quickly. Elias's attorneys filed motions to dismiss, arguing that environmental statutes had never been intended to criminalize accidents. They insisted Scott's injuries were tragic but unforeseeable. They claimed the government was twisting vague regulations into criminal law. It was, in many ways, the fight Elias wanted, not just over facts, but over the very philosophy of regulation. If he won, it would reaffirm what he had always believed, that environmental crimes were paperwork matters, not felonies. If he lost, it could set a precedent that terrified polluters nationwide. For prosecutors, that was exactly the point. They didn't just want to punish Elias. They wanted to send a message. That poisoning a worker with industrial waste was no different from shooting a gun into a crowded room. That hiding behind corporate paperwork would no longer shield owners from responsibility. That environmental crime was, at its core, human crime. As the trial date neared, tension mounted. Elias grew more combative, railing in private that the government was ruining him. His lawyers prepared for war, lining up experts to question the lab results, to suggest Scott's collapse was due to heat or exhaustion rather than cyanide. They planned to poke holes in every witness, to paint regulators as overzealous. But for every maneuver, prosecutors had a counter. Scott's seizures, the cyanide samples, Elias's own words. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would stretch for months, a clash not just between government and defendant, but between two visions of justice. One where workplace deaths and injuries were accidents, and one where they were crimes. And for the first time in his life, Allan Elias wasn't holding the cards. The courthouse in Boise was not accustomed to cases like this. Its walls had heard countless drug conspiracies, fraud schemes, and violent crimes. But never before had it hosted a trial where the charge was, in essence, poisoning a worker with industrial waste. For weeks, anticipation buzzed. Reporters from across the Northwest gathered, scribbling notes about the unusual prosecution. Environmental activists hailed it as groundbreaking. Business groups muttered about government overreach. And in Soda Springs, every newspaper headline was devoured, every update debated at the diner. Opening statements set the tone. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Breitsameter rose first, his voice steady but charged with purpose. He told the jury about Scott Dominguez, 20 years old, eager to work, sent into a tank with no respirator, no ventilation, no warning. He described how cyanide fumes clawed at Scott's lungs, how his body convulsed in seizures, how his life was stolen in minutes. Then Breitsameter pointed at the defendant. This man, he said, eyes locked on Elias, knew the dangers. He ignored them. He lied to his workers. And when tragedy struck, he lied to the government. That is not an accident. That is a crime. The room was silent. Jurors shifted, some nodding almost unconsciously. When Elias's defense attorney stood, the contrast was stark. His tone was smooth, practiced, meant to reassure rather than inflame. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is not a crime. This is a tragedy. A tragic accident in a difficult industry. My client, Mr. Elias, never intended harm. He relied on his workers to follow instructions, and he believed the tank was safe. What the government wants you to believe is unprecedented. That an accident should be treated like a felony. He leaned into the broader theme, government overreach. If they can put Allan Elias in prison for this, then every small business owner in America is at risk when something goes wrong. It was a clever strategy, frame Elias not as a reckless boss, but as a symbol of hardworking entrepreneurs under siege. The prosecution's first witnesses were the workers themselves. Brian Smith testified about refusing to go into the tank without proper gear. His voice cracked as he recalled warning Elias, "They'll die in there." Darren Weaver described the moment he and Scott descended. The sudden burning in his chest, Scott whispering, "I can't breathe," before collapsing. He told the jury how he scrambled out, gasping for air, terrified he had left his friend to die. Gene Thornock recalled his desperate attempt to drag Scott out, feeling his own lungs seize, the moment he realized he couldn't save him without losing his own life. Each testimony was devastating. The jurors watched the men's faces, heard the fear in their voices, and saw the truth. This wasn't exaggeration. This was survival. Then came the experts. Chemists explained the lab results. Cyanide residues at lethal levels. Safety specialists detailed the OSHA rules, confined space permits, respirators, oxygen tests, and how Evergreen had ignored everyone. One expert said bluntly, "The air in that tank was not survivable. To send men inside without protection was a death sentence." The defense tried to poke holes. They suggested heat exhaustion, dehydration, or stress could explain Scott's collapse. They questioned lab procedures, hinting at contamination. They argued cyanide levels were exaggerated, that the tank's dangers had been overstated. But each time, prosecutors countered with data, testimony, and the undeniable fact of Scott's injuries. And then, in a moment that silenced the courtroom, prosecutors called the Dominguez family. Scott could not testify in the traditional sense. His seizures and cognitive damage left him unable to speak clearly. But the jury was shown his reality. His twisted limbs, his halting movements, the seizures that racked his body. They saw Theresa holding his hand, his mother adjusting his headrest. It was not evidence in the usual sense. It was something more powerful, a reminder that this case wasn't about paperwork, but about a human life altered forever. Some jurors wiped their eyes. Even the judge looked down, pausing before moving the trial forward. Elias sat stone-faced at the defense table. To some observers, his coldness was damning. Where Scott's family radiated pain, Elias radiated irritation, as if the trial itself were an inconvenience. Reporters noted how rarely he looked at Scott, how often he whispered angrily to his lawyers. That contrast was impossible to ignore. By the end of the prosecution's case, a narrative had crystallized. Scott had been sent into a lethal tank. Elias had ignored repeated warnings. The aftermath wasn't just negligence. It was lies, cover-ups, and defiance. The defense prepared to call its own witnesses to argue that Elias was being made a scapegoat. But already the momentum seemed to be shifting. For the first time in his life, Elias was not the man controlling the room. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom exhaled. Jurors had heard weeks of testimony, seen Scott Dominguez's condition firsthand, and watched Elias's cold expression. Now it was the defense's turn to answer. Elias's attorneys rose with practiced confidence. They knew their client was facing decades in prison. Their job wasn't to win outright. It was to plant doubt, to convince just one juror that this was an accident blown out of proportion. Their first line of attack was the science. Defense experts questioned the lab work, suggesting that samples had been mishandled. They pointed to chain of custody forms with minor errors, hinting at sloppy record-keeping. They suggested that cyanide levels could have been exaggerated, or that cross-contamination skewed results. But under cross-examination, prosecutors dismantled those theories. Chain of custody? Minor clerical mistakes, not evidence of tampering. Cross-contamination? Impossible given the sealed procedures. Cyanide exaggeration? The numbers were consistent across multiple labs. Jurors leaned forward, taking notes as prosecution witnesses calmly explained the redundancies built into every test. By the time the experts stepped down, the defense's science looked shaky at best. Next came the alternative explanations. The defense floated the idea that Scott's collapse wasn't cyanide poisoning at all, but heat exhaustion, dehydration, or even a pre-existing condition. One doctor suggested that Idaho's summer heat could have overwhelmed him, tank or no tank. But prosecutors had anticipated this. They called rebuttal witnesses who pointed out that the tank was not hot that day. In fact, it was cooler inside than outside. And Scott's seizures, brain damage, and long-term impairments were consistent with cyanide exposure, not heat stroke. The jury listened closely, their expressions hard to read. But the defense's theory sounded less like an explanation and more like a stretch. Perhaps most damaging to Elias were the workers called by the defense. Elias's attorneys hoped they would support the idea that safety was taken seriously, that Elias had never knowingly endangered anyone. But under oath, even the most loyal employees hesitated. Some admitted that respirators were rarely available. Others recalled how Elias dismissed concerns with sarcasm or anger. One worker, clearly nervous, admitted that Elias had told them more than once to just get it done when they raised safety issues. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Elias himself never testified. His lawyers advised against it. He was too volatile, too quick to anger, too dismissive. The risk of him snapping on the stand, insulting prosecutors, or contradicting himself was too high. So he sat silently, watching as others spoke for him, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed forward. To jurors, his silence was deafening. In their closing arguments, the defense doubled down on the theme of government overreach. They painted Elias as a small businessman persecuted by regulators desperate for a headline. This case is about punishment, not justice. One attorney told the jury, "The government wants to make an example out of Allan Elias. But you cannot send a man to prison for an accident." It was polished, confident, designed to resonate with Idaho's independent streak. But it also rang hollow against the mountain of evidence the jury had just heard. The prosecution's rebuttal was simple, powerful, and direct. "This was no accident," Bright Sameter told the jury. "This was a man who was warned over and over again, and who ignored those warnings until a worker was poisoned for life. That is not an accident. That is a crime. And if the law means anything, then Allan Elias must be held accountable." As the jury left to deliberate, tension gripped the courtroom. Scott's family held hands, praying. Reporters whispered predictions. Elias sat rigid, his lawyers whispering strategies for appeals, already preparing for the worst. For the first time, the case was out of everyone's hands. It belonged to 12 strangers behind a closed door. The courtroom was hushed as the jury filed out to deliberate. For weeks, they had listened to witnesses, stared at charts of chemical levels, and watched a young man's broken body rolled before them. Now, 12 ordinary citizens held the fate of Allan Elias in their hands. Deliberations began slowly. Jurors sifted through binders of exhibits, argued over technicalities, revisited testimony. Some voiced doubts. Was cyanide really the cause? Was Elias reckless? Or just careless? But as they reviewed the evidence, patterns emerged. The cyanide readings were consistent across multiple labs. The workers' stories matched, detail for detail. The safety violations weren't just mistakes, they were systemic. And above all, there was Scott. His seizures, his wheelchair, his vacant stares. The jury couldn't ignore the human toll. Hours turned into a day turned into 2. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, filing updates every hour. Families paced the hallways. Inside the deliberation room, arguments gave way to consensus. By the 3rd day, the jury was ready. When the foreman stood in court, the room went silent. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of knowingly endangering his workers under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Guilty. On the charge of making false statements to investigators. Guilty. On the charge of violating workplace safety standards in a way that caused catastrophic harm. Guilty. Each word landed like a hammer. Scott's family gripped each other, tears spilling. Theresa buried her face in her hands. For them, this was justice, long delayed but finally real. At the defense table, Elias sat stone-faced, eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, but the fury was visible in the tension of his jaw. For a man who had always believed he could outwit the system, the verdict was a personal betrayal. The news rippled outward like shockwaves. In Soda Springs, residents read the headlines with a mix of satisfaction and unease. Some said justice had been done. Elias had always acted untouchable, and now he wasn't. Others worried what it meant for local businesses, if every accident could bring prison time. In Washington, D.C., environmental advocates hailed the verdict as historic. For decades, environmental laws had been enforced with fines, slaps on the wrist, consent decrees. Now, for the first time, a jury had said, "This is a crime against people and it deserves prison." And in corporate boardrooms, the message was clear. Cutting corners could cost not just profits, but freedom. For Scott's family, the verdict didn't undo the damage. Scott remained trapped in a body that betrayed him, his future stolen. But knowing Elias would face prison gave them something they hadn't had since that summer day in 1996. A sense that someone, at least, had been held accountable. Theresa later recalled that moment. "It wasn't joy," she said quietly. "It was relief. Relief that people finally saw what we had seen all along, that Scott's life mattered." The sentencing was still to come. Prosecutors prepared to argue for decades behind bars, pointing to Elias's history, his arrogance, and the suffering he had caused. Defense attorneys prepared their appeals, claiming the trial was unfair, the law misapplied. But no matter what happened next, the verdict itself was a milestone. For the first time, environmental crime had been treated not as a regulatory slip, but as a felony that tore through a family and a community. And at the center of it all was a man who had believed he was untouchable, until a jury proved him wrong. The trial was done, the verdict delivered. But one question remained. How many years would Allan Elias spend in prison? For prosecutors, this was the heart of the case. They hadn't fought just for a guilty verdict. They wanted a sentence that would echo far beyond Idaho. A warning to every industrial boss who thought environmental crimes were just paperwork violations. The sentencing hearing began months later. The courtroom was full once again. Scott's family sat in the front row, gripping each other's hands. Reporters filled the benches. Lawyers shuffled papers, preparing arguments that would shape the rest of Elias's life. Prosecutor George Brightsameter rose first. He reminded the judge of Scott Dominguez's suffering, the seizures, the permanent brain damage, the life stolen at 20. He reminded the court of Elias's history. The citations ignored, the regulators fought, the arrogance that led directly to this disaster. This defendant, Bright Sameter declared, did not make a mistake. He made a choice. He chose profits over people, defiance over responsibility, lies over truth. For that, he must face the maximum penalty the law allows. He asked for 17 years in federal prison, a sentence that would not only punish Elias, but set a precedent nationwide. The defense countered. Elias's attorney argued that the government was inflating the case, that Elias had already been ruined financially, his business destroyed, his reputation shredded. To send this man to prison for nearly 2 decades, the attorney said, is not justice. It is vengeance. This was an accident, tragic, yes, but still an accident. No one benefits from destroying what remains of Mr. Elias's life. They pleaded for leniency, a few years at most, maybe probation. Anything less than double digits. Elias himself was given a chance to speak. He rose, straight-backed, voice sharp. Instead of remorse, he delivered defiance. He insisted he had never intended harm. He blamed regulators for hounding him, blamed workers for not following instructions, even blamed the media for turning him into a villain. He never once apologized to Scott or his family. The courtroom was stunned. Where jurors had hoped for contrition, Elias offered only arrogance. Scott's mother, listening from the front row, whispered to Theresa, "He'll never change." The judge leaned forward, his words deliberate, heavy. He acknowledged the gravity of the case, not only Scott's suffering, but the broader message it carried. Environmental crimes, he said, were too often dismissed as civil matters. But this case was different. A young man's life had been destroyed, and Elias had been warned again and again before it happened. Then came the ruling. 17 years in federal prison. The maximum sentence allowed. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Scott's family clutched each other, tears flowing, not from joy but from relief. The sense that, at last, Elias would face real consequences. At the defense table, Elias's face hardened. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, as if the entire system had betrayed him. His attorneys immediately vowed to appeal. The sentence made national headlines. Environmental advocates hailed it as a turning point, proof that polluters could no longer hide behind paperwork. Business groups warned of a dangerous precedent, fearing more prosecutions. But in Idaho, the story was simpler. The man who had long seemed untouchable was going to prison. For Scott Dominguez, it didn't bring back his health. His seizures, his wheelchair, his dependence on others remained. But for his family, it meant something they had waited years to hear. Justice had spoken with a full voice. For most defendants, a 17-year prison sentence would break the spirit. But for Allan Elias, it only sharpened his resolve. He had spent decades fighting regulators, dragging cases through court, burying opponents in paperwork. Prison, he believed, would be no different. Within days of his sentencing, his attorneys filed notices of appeal. The arguments were familiar. The government had overreached. The jury had been misled. The law had been twisted beyond recognition. If the trial had been about facts, the appeal would be about philosophy. The appeal centered on 3 key claims. First, Elias argued that the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, was never meant to be used this way. It was designed, he said, for waste disposal violations, not workplace accidents. By charging him under RCRA's knowing endangerment provision, prosecutors had criminalized what should have been handled with fines. Second, he claimed the jury had been tainted by emotion, showing Scott's condition in court, the seizures, the wheelchair, the visible suffering, had turned the trial into a sympathy contest, he argued, rather than a fair assessment of the facts. Third, he alleged procedural errors, faulty jury instructions, biased testimony, and prosecutorial overreach. His lawyers wrote page after page, hoping to chip away at the verdict. The appeal climbed its way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most influential benches in the country. Oral arguments drew national attention. Environmental lawyers watched closely. If Elias succeeded, the precedent set in Boise could unravel. His attorneys stood before the panel of judges and repeated their case. That this was overreach, that accidents happen, that the law was being stretched beyond its intent. They painted Elias as a target, a scapegoat. The government's response was blunt. This was not an accident, the prosecutor said. This was a foreseeable tragedy caused by years of warnings ignored. The law is clear. Knowingly endangering others is a crime. And Allan Elias did just that. The judges listened, asked questions, pressed on definitions. But in the end, their ruling was decisive. The Ninth Circuit upheld Elias's conviction and sentence. They rejected every major claim. The law had been applied properly, the jury had not been improperly swayed, and the evidence was overwhelming. It was a crushing blow to Elias. His attorneys filed further petitions, even appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the High Court declined to hear the case, letting the conviction stand. With appeals exhausted, Elias's fate was sealed. He would serve his full term in federal prison. For a man who had always believed he could fight his way out of anything, it was the ultimate defeat. The impact of the case spread far beyond Elias's cell. Legal journals dissected the ruling, calling it a landmark for environmental enforcement. Law schools added it to curricula on environmental law and criminal justice. Corporate compliance officers took notice. Companies that once saw safety as optional now understood the stakes. Cutting corners wasn't just risky, it could send executives to prison. For prosecutors, the case became a model. They cited United States versus Allan Elias in future trials, using it to justify aggressive prosecutions against polluters and negligent managers. And for Scott's family, the appeals process was another chapter in a long struggle. Each hearing reopened the wound, each motion dragged the case forward. But as the years passed, they found solace in one fact: Elias's conviction was unshakable. Behind prison walls, Elias remained combative. He filed grievances, sued prison officials, and continued to cast himself as a victim of government persecution. But outside, the world moved on, and his name became less a source of fear in Soda Springs and more a cautionary tale in law books. While lawyers fought over statutes and appeals, Scott Dominguez's life became a different kind of battlefield. One measured not in legal victories, but in hospital visits, seizures, and the quiet persistence of survival. Scott had entered the tank at 20 years old, a young man full of energy, with a fiancée he adored and a future he believed was wide open. When he came out, he was a shell of the person he had been. The brain damage was permanent. Doctors explained that cyanide had starved his cells of oxygen, leaving his nervous system scarred. His once quick mind now struggled with memory and speech. His hands shook. His body betrayed him with violent seizures that could come without warning. Tasks that once took seconds now required help. Eating, dressing, even holding a pen. His independence was gone. For Theresa, the young woman who had once planned a wedding with Scott, life became a choice between heartbreak and devotion. She chose devotion. She stayed by his side, helping him through therapies, sitting with him during seizures, calming him when confusion turned to panic. Friends admired her loyalty. Some whispered that it was too much for someone so young. But Theresa never wavered. "I loved him before this happened," she said once. "And I love him still. He didn't choose this. He was put here." His family bore the weight too. Scott's mother became his fiercest advocate, navigating insurance claims, fighting for medical coverage, coordinating appointments. His stepfather adapted their home for wheelchairs and hospital beds. Siblings pitched in as they could, though the strain was heavy. Every day was a reminder of what had been stolen. When neighbors' children went to college, Scott was relearning how to hold a spoon. When old classmates started families, he was relearning how to form words. Financially, the case was devastating. Lawsuits and compensation battles dragged on, but no amount of money could keep up with the cost of lifelong care. The Dominguez family held fundraisers, leaned on the community, and did whatever they could to keep Scott comfortable. And yet, despite it all, Scott retained flashes of the boy he had been. His smile, though slower, still lit up when Theresa walked in the room. His laughter, though halting, still bubbled up at family jokes. Even amid brain injury, the spark of his spirit remained. The community rallied. Soda Springs was small, and people remembered Scott as the kid who had played football, the young man who had worked hard at Evergreen. Churches held benefits. Neighbors brought meals. At times, it felt like the whole town carried him. But there was also an undercurrent of anger. People whispered about Elias, about how one man's arrogance had left Scott in this state. Some wanted to forget, to move on. Others couldn't, not when they saw Scott's wheelchair at every community event. Nationally, Scott became a symbol. Newspapers wrote about him as the human face of environmental crime. Law schools mentioned his name when discussing workplace safety. To many, he was proof that corporate negligence wasn't an abstract issue, it was flesh and blood. But for Scott himself, those abstractions didn't matter. What mattered was whether he would make it through another seizure, whether he would be strong enough to attend a family gathering, whether Theresa would still be there when he woke up. The trial had brought accountability, yes, but no verdict, no sentence could give Scott back his 20s, or his 30s, or the life that had been stolen in a single breath of poison. And so, while the headlines faded, the Dominguez family lived with the consequences every day, quietly, painfully, and with a resilience that outshone the arrogance of the man who had caused it all. In Soda Springs, the story of Allan Elias lingered like a scar. The trial was done, the sentence handed down, but the town that had once relied on him for jobs and contracts could not easily forget what had happened. At the local diner, people still argued over coffee. Some believed justice had finally come, that Elias had always been a bully, a man who cut corners, and that the verdict proved he was no different inside a courtroom than he was in business. Others shook their heads, saying the government had gone too far, that it could have been any small business owner sitting in that chair. But whether they sympathized with Elias or condemned him, everyone agreed on one thing: Soda Springs had been changed. The case cast a long shadow over local industry. Business owners became cautious. Safety manuals were dusted off. Confined space rules that had once been ignored were suddenly enforced. Respirators, once left in closets, began showing up on job sites. It wasn't just fear of regulators. It was the vivid memory of what had happened to Scott. Employers couldn't send a man into a tank without remembering the seizure, the wheelchair, the verdict. And in that way, Scott's suffering shaped behavior long after the trial ended. Nationally, the impact was even greater. For decades, environmental crimes had been treated as regulatory violations, the kind of thing that ended with fines or settlements. But now, headlines shouted a new reality. Idaho man sentenced to 17 years for environmental crime. Landmark case treats workplace poisoning as felony. Suddenly, corporate America paid attention. Compliance officers gave urgent briefings. Lawyers advised CEOs that safety violations could now carry prison time. What had once been the cost of doing business had become a matter of personal freedom. The Environmental Protection Agency pointed to the case as proof that its Criminal Investigation Division had teeth. For years, critics had accused the EPA of being powerless, but now prosecutors had a precedent. If you knowingly endangered workers with toxic waste, you could face the same penalties as a drug trafficker or fraudster. Law schools taught the case. Professors used it as an example of how statutes written for hazardous waste could protect not just land and water, but people. Activists cited it when lobbying for tougher enforcement. And in courtrooms across the country, prosecutors referenced United States versus Allan Elias as justification for bringing criminal charges in environmental cases. The ripple effect was undeniable. Back in Soda Springs, though, the reality was more personal. The Dominguez family still carried the daily burden of Scott's care. Neighbors organized charity drives, sold raffle tickets, passed collection jars in churches. Every act of support was a reminder that Scott's tragedy was not forgotten. But it was also a reminder that it had never gone away. And the name Elias? It became a shorthand for arrogance and danger. Parents warned their kids about taking shortcuts at work. Don't end up like Scott. Don't trust someone like Elias. Even years later, when the case was no longer on the front page, the story lived on in the quiet conversations of a small Idaho town. For Allan Elias himself, the world beyond Soda Springs carried on. a world he could no longer control. Behind bars, his bluster meant little. He was not the boss, not the man with the biggest office in town. He was just another inmate with a number. But the legacy of his actions stretched far beyond his prison cell. He had not only destroyed Scott's life, he had forced America to confront a question it had long avoided. When environmental crime hurts people, should it be treated as a regulatory violation or as a felony? And the answer, in the wake of Elias's conviction, was now clear. When the prison gates closed behind Allan Elias, the sound was final. Iron on iron, the clang of authority he could no longer bend to his will. For decades, Elias had been the man in charge. He set the rules at Evergreen Resources. He argued with regulators. He dismissed workers' complaints with a wave of his hand. But inside federal prison, none of that mattered. He was not Mr. Elias anymore. He was an inmate with a number, a bunk assignment, and a uniform like everyone else. Prison life did not come easily to him. Inmates who had grown up in poverty looked at him with disdain. Guards who knew his case, and many did, saw him not as a criminal mastermind, but as a man who had poisoned his own worker through greed. Elias bristled under the routines, the counts, the lockdowns, the strip searches. For a man accustomed to defiance, obedience was a foreign language. He filed grievances constantly about food quality, about medical care, about prison conditions. Each was stamped, processed, and quietly denied. But he kept filing, as if paperwork were still a weapon that could win him battles. His arrogance never fully dimmed. Fellow inmates recalled him as someone who talked too much about his innocence, about how the government had railroaded him. He painted himself as a martyr of overreach, a businessman destroyed by bureaucrats. But there was no jury here to persuade, no regulator to outlast. His words bounced off the concrete walls and dissolved into the indifference of men serving their own sentences. To most, he was just another prisoner, aging, frustrated, irrelevant. And yet, Elias never stopped scheming. He tried to mount new legal challenges, filing appeals long after courts had declared his case closed. He sued prison officials, alleging mistreatment. None of it succeeded, but each filing gave him the illusion of control, the feeling that he was still fighting, still the man who could bend the system to his will. Privately, though, he faced the humiliation of decline. His health began to falter. His hair thinned, his frame softened. The man who once walked into courtrooms in tailored suits now shuffled through prison corridors in faded khakis. Meanwhile, Scott's name followed him. Even behind bars, Elias could not escape the story. Newspapers that covered environmental law occasionally revived the case, reminding the public that he was serving time for poisoning a worker. Law journals dissected his trial, using his name as a warning. Every mention was another reminder. He was not a pioneer, not a businessman, but a felon. Back in Soda Springs, people sometimes asked what had become of him. The answer was always the same. He was locked away, filing paperwork, trying to prove a point no one wanted to hear. For some, it was justice. For others, it was a sad end to a man who might have built something good, if only arrogance hadn't consumed him. Inside his cell at night, Elias was left with silence. No workers to command. No lawyers to argue with. No jury to perform for. Just the hum of prison lights and the steady tick of a clock that no grievance could slow. For the Dominguez family, the verdict against Allan Elias had brought a measure of justice. But when the news crews packed up and the headlines faded, they were left with the harder truth. Scott's condition was permanent. Life became a cycle of appointments, medications, and constant vigilance. Seizures could come without warning. 1 minute Scott might be calm, the next his body convulsed, his eyes rolled back, and his loved ones rushed to keep him safe. Each episode was terrifying, a reminder of how fragile he had become. His mother shouldered the heaviest weight. She became his nurse, his advocate, his voice in the endless maze of insurance forms and medical bureaucracy. The government had punished Elias, yes, but compensation for Scott's care was another labyrinth entirely. Some programs helped. Others denied coverage. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out before her, wondering how much longer they could keep up. Theresa, his fiancée, never walked away. The life she had once imagined, marriage, children, shared adventures, had been shattered in that tank. And yet she stayed. She became not just a partner but a caregiver, helping Scott eat, comforting him during seizures, reminding him of memories when his mind faltered. Her loyalty inspired admiration, but it also carried unspoken heartbreak. Friends whispered that she had sacrificed her own youth, that she was living a life of caretaking instead of chasing her dreams. But Theresa brushed it off. "This is where I belong," she said once. "Scott didn't choose this. None of us did. But we don't walk away." The family's resilience became a story in itself. Local churches organized fundraisers. Neighbors held raffles and bake sales to cover medical costs. Each dollar was a symbol of solidarity, a reminder that Scott's suffering was not born alone. Yet the emotional toll was immeasurable. Every holiday carried a shadow. Every birthday marked another year of what might have been. When old friends visited, laughter sometimes gave way to awkward silences as they struggled to reconcile the young man they remembered with the broken body before them. And still, Scott showed flashes of the person he had been. When a familiar song played, he sometimes tapped his foot. When Theresa told a joke, he managed a crooked smile. When his mother held his hand, he squeezed back, however faintly. Those small moments, fleeting, fragile, were enough to sustain his family. They reminded them that beneath the scars, Scott was still there. Nationally, the Dominguez family's story resonated. News profiles framed Scott as the human face of environmental crime, a living reminder of why laws mattered. Politicians invoked his name when pushing for stricter enforcement. Advocates carried his story into boardrooms, into classrooms, into congressional hearings. But for the family, the attention was bittersweet. They wanted the world to learn from Scott's suffering, but they also wanted privacy, peace, the ability to live without cameras peering in. Balancing the two was another burden they hadn't asked for. Through it all, the Dominguez family embodied a truth the trial could never capture: that justice in court does not erase tragedy at home. The verdict had punished Elias, but it could not restore Scott's health, could not return the years lost, could not undo the heartbreak. What it did provide, in moments of exhaustion and grief, was the knowledge that they had fought, and won, against a man who thought himself untouchable. And in that, there was a quiet dignity. For years, environmental enforcement had been seen as a backwater of the justice system. Inspectors wrote citations. Agencies levied fines. Companies paid penalties, grumbled about bureaucracy, and went back to business as usual. But the Elias case changed everything. When federal prosecutors brought the indictment, many doubted it would hold. Charging a small-town contractor under a hazardous waste law and tying that to a worker's poisoning seemed unprecedented. If they lost, it could cripple future efforts. If they won, it could rewrite the playbook. The prosecutors who took the case were relentless. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Bright-Sameter and his team spent years digging through documents, interviewing witnesses, battling defense motions. They weren't just trying a man, they were testing the strength of the law itself. And when the verdict came down guilty on all counts, it wasn't just Elias who had been judged. It was proof that environmental crimes could be prosecuted like any other felony. For the prosecutors, it was the kind of victory that defines a career. They had stood against a stubborn, combative defendant, armed with money and lawyers, and convinced a jury that negligence wasn't just sloppy, it was criminal. For the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, the case was validation. The agency had long faced criticism that it lacked teeth, that its agents were glorified auditors. But here, their investigation had led directly to a landmark conviction. The canary in the coal mine had sung, and the nation had listened. EPA agents who had knocked on Elias's door, who had tested the soil and air, who had endured his sneers and stonewalling. Now they could point to a sentence of 17 years and know their work mattered. The case also shifted culture inside government. Before Elias, many prosecutors hesitated to pursue environmental crimes aggressively, fearing juries wouldn't care or laws wouldn't stick. After Elias, those excuses faded. The precedent was there, the pathway proven. Training manuals began citing the case. Conferences on environmental law showcased it. Young attorneys entered the field inspired by the idea that pollution cases weren't just about trees and rivers, they were about people. Yet, behind the professional pride was something more personal. Many of the prosecutors and investigators had met Scott. They had seen him in court, in his wheelchair, struggling to speak. They carried that image with them into every legal brief, every oral argument, every long night preparing for trial. Winning wasn't just about legal precedent. It was about doing right by a young man whose life had been stolen. For the regulators who had battled Elias before the disaster, there was vindication too. Years earlier, they had written citations, begged for compliance, warned of danger. Elias had laughed them off, treated them as nuisances. Now they had proof their concerns had been justified, and a jury had agreed. It didn't erase the frustration of years spent ignored, but it proved that arrogance had consequences. The Elias case became a watershed moment for environmental enforcement. No longer just paperwork, no longer just fines. Now there was prison time. Now executives across the country took notice. And behind that shift were the regulators and prosecutors who refused to back down, who had turned a tragedy in Soda Springs into a national precedent. For most people, environmental law had always felt distant, about smokestacks, rivers, endangered species. It was important, yes, but abstract. The story of Scott Dominguez changed that. Suddenly, it wasn't about wildlife refuges or wetlands. It was about a young man in a wheelchair, his life shattered because someone cut corners. That image, carried through newspapers, television, and law journals, forced Americans to confront a truth. Environmental crimes are human crimes. Public perception began to shift. Where once companies treated safety regulations as red tape, communities began to see them as lifelines. Workers who might have stayed silent about hazards started to speak up. Some demanded respirators, safety harnesses, or proper training. The phrase knowing endangerment, once legal jargon, entered the vocabulary of activists and union leaders. They pointed to Elias as proof that negligence wasn't just a cost of doing business. It was a potential felony. Business leaders, too, took notice. Across boardrooms, compliance officers warned executives, "You could be next." Training seminars used the Elias case as a cautionary tale. Company newsletters reminded managers that ignoring safety could carry personal consequences. Some firms quietly improved safety programs. Others went further, hiring environmental consultants, upgrading equipment, building a culture where workers were encouraged to report hazards. Fear may have been the motivator, but change was the outcome. The case also influenced media and culture. Documentaries and magazine features highlighted it as a turning point. Law professors cited it in op-eds, framing it as the moment America realized pollution wasn't just about landscapes. It was about people's bodies and futures. In classrooms, students debated the balance between economic growth and safety. Some saw Elias as a warning of unchecked capitalism. Others viewed the government's prosecution as a model for accountability. Either way, the case had entered the cultural bloodstream. For environmental advocates, the conviction became a rallying cry. It emboldened campaigns for stronger laws, larger budgets for enforcement, and harsher penalties for violators. They held up Scott's story in legislative hearings, asking lawmakers, "If this happened in your district, would a fine be enough?" The ripple effect reached Congress, state legislatures, and corporate boardrooms alike. But beyond policies and politics, there was something deeper. The Elias case reminded Americans of the fragile trust between workers and employers. A man had gone to his job, followed orders, and returned broken. That betrayal resonated far beyond Soda Springs. It wasn't just an environmental crime. It was a violation of the most basic social contract, that no one should have to risk their life to earn a paycheck. Years later, when people remembered the case, they didn't quote statutes or cite legal briefs. They remembered Scott. They remembered a courtroom where a young man, shaking and broken, sat before a jury. They remembered a defiant boss who refused to apologize. And they remembered a judge who finally said, "Enough." By the time Allan Elias had spent more than a decade behind bars, the world outside had largely forgotten him. New scandals filled the headlines. New trials set new precedents. In Soda Springs, his name was still remembered, but less as a living figure and more as a story parents told their kids. A warning of what happens when greed outweighs responsibility. Inside prison, however, Elias still fought battles no one else cared about. He continued to file motions and complaints. Prison food was inadequate. Medical treatment was substandard. Officials were corrupt. Every grievance was written in the same combative tone he had once used against regulators and lawyers on the outside. But the system was unmoved. Petitions were denied, lawsuits dismissed. To judges, he was no longer a high-profile defendant, but just another inmate refusing to accept his conviction. Age began to catch up with him. The sharp-suited businessman of the 1980s was gone. His hair thinned, his back hunched, his stride slowed. The man who once controlled crews of workers now stood in line for meals, shuffled through security checks, and submitted to the authority of guards half his age. Illness crept in, too. Years of stress, poor diet, and confinement wore on his health. For the first time, Elias couldn't bluster or bully his way past weakness. Yet even in decline, he clung to defiance. He told anyone who would listen that he had been framed, that the government had twisted the law, that he had been a victim of politics. Other inmates humored him or ignored him. Guards rolled their eyes. His audience had vanished, but the performance went on. Apology never crossed his lips. Regret never softened his tone. For Elias, admitting guilt would have meant surrender, and surrender was the one act he refused. Meanwhile, the world outside moved forward. Scott Dominguez's family kept living with the consequences of Elias's decisions. Regulators cited his case as precedent in new prosecutions. Activists used his name in campaigns for stricter protections. Each time his name appeared in print, it was never as a pioneer or businessman. It was as a felon, the man who had sent a worker into a cyanide-filled tank. His legacy had been written whether he liked it or not. In the stillness of his cell, as years stacked into decades, Elias was left with the one truth he could not outmaneuver. The system he had mocked had finally outlasted him. Time is supposed to heal, that's what people say. But for the Dominguez family, time was a double-edged sword. The sharp sting of the trial and the headlines faded, yes. The name Elias appeared less in their conversations. But the daily reality of Scott's injuries did not fade. If anything, it deepened. As the years passed, caring for Scott became not just an emergency response, but a way of life. Routines shaped their days. Mornings meant medication schedules, careful feeding, and gentle physical therapy to keep his muscles from tightening. Afternoons often brought doctor visits, therapists, or the endless shuffle of insurance paperwork. Nights meant watching for seizures, making sure he didn't choke in his sleep. His mother, weathered but determined, remained his anchor. The lines on her face spoke of years of vigilance, of nights spent awake listening for her son's breathing. She was his advocate in every system, medical, legal, financial. A role she never chose but carried with relentless love. Theresa's devotion endured. She had been a teenager when Scott collapsed in that tank, and now she was a woman grown, with the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders. Her friends married, had children, chased careers. She stayed, loyal to a man whose life had been rewritten in an instant. There were moments of heartbreak, of course. Watching couples dance at weddings. Seeing classmates post pictures of family vacations. Knowing that her life had been diverted by another man's arrogance. And yet, when she looked at Scott, she said she still saw the boy she had loved. In the faint smile when she entered the room. In the squeeze of his hand when she spoke his name. The community's support never fully waned. Neighbors checked in. Churches still organized fundraisers. Local businesses held raffles to cover medical costs. Even as years stretched on, Soda Springs remembered Scott. His presence at town events, in his chair with his family by his side, was a living reminder of what had happened, and of what resilience looked like. To the younger generation, he became a cautionary tale. Teachers told his story in safety briefings, reminding students that regulations weren't abstractions. They were written in blood. And yet, despite the tragedy, there were moments of grace. At family gatherings, when nieces and nephews climbed into his lap, Scott's eyes lit up. When music played, his foot still tapped in rhythm. When someone cracked a joke, his laughter, slower, quieter, but still real, filled the room. These were the victories his family clung to. Not headlines or verdicts, but small moments of life reclaimed from disaster. Nationally, his story remained a touchstone. Lawmakers cited him when pushing for stronger safety laws. Lawyers mentioned him when explaining the stakes of negligence. Advocates carried his name into courtrooms as proof of why enforcement mattered. But for his family, it was simpler than all that. Scott wasn't a symbol. He was a son, a partner, a brother. A man robbed of his future, yet still here. Still fighting in the only ways he could. And as the years passed, the family's perseverance became its own kind of quiet defiance. A refusal to let Elias's arrogance be the final word. In the decades after the cyanide tank in Soda Springs, the story of Allan, Elias, and Scott Dominguez became more than a case file. It became a reference point, a lesson, a warning. Law schools still taught it. Environmental law courses cited United States versus Elias as the turning point when regulatory violation became felony crime. Prosecutors who had cut their teeth on the case went on to train others, carrying its lessons into new courtrooms. The precedent held. Again and again, when companies endangered workers or dumped toxins illegally, prosecutors pointed to Elias as proof. These laws have teeth. For regulators, it was a watershed. Before Elias, inspectors sometimes felt powerless, issuing fines that went unpaid, watching companies shrug off citations. After Elias, they carried a new authority. They could look an executive in the eye and remind them, this isn't just paperwork. You could go to prison. That shift rippled through industries. Businesses that once calculated fines as a cost of doing business began to calculate prison time as an unacceptable risk. Compliance departments grew. Safety officers gained leverage. The cultural impact lasted, too. Activists used the case to argue for stronger protections. Workers used it to demand safer conditions. Journalists used it to remind readers that environmental crime was not abstract. It was flesh and blood, seizures and wheelchairs. And in communities like Soda Springs, the memory of Scott ensured that safety regulations were taken seriously. His story was retold in training sessions, in classrooms, in whispered warnings at job sites. For Elias himself, there was no legacy worth claiming. His name lived on not as a builder of industry but as a symbol of arrogance. He was remembered less for what he created than for what he destroyed. His empire crumbled, his reputation vanished, and even his family ties frayed under the weight of scandal and disgrace. But for Scott, there was a different kind of legacy. Though his body had been broken, his story helped protect others. Workers he would never meet put on respirators, stood up to bosses, or called regulators because they had heard what had happened to him. In a way, Scott became the silent guardian of countless others. His suffering transformed into prevention. In Washington, D.C., the case was sometimes still invoked at congressional hearings. Lawmakers debating environmental budgets would recall the Idaho precedent. Proof that laws mattered, proof that enforcement saved lives. And in the Environmental Protection Agency, agents who joined years later learned about Elias during training. His case was part of their institutional memory, their badge of credibility. Over time, the Elias case came to represent something larger than itself. It wasn't just about cyanide or Idaho or one reckless contractor. It was about what kind of country America wanted to be. Would laws be words on paper, or would they carry the weight of justice? Would workers be expendable, or would their lives be valued enough to prosecute those who endangered them? The conviction had answered those questions, and that answer echoed long after the courtroom lights dimmed. The story of Allan, Elias, and Scott Dominguez began in a small Idaho town, in a tank filled with poison, in a moment of arrogance that changed lives forever. It wound its way through courtrooms, across headlines, into the chambers of Congress and the pages of law books. It shook families, reshaped careers, and forced a country to ask itself what justice really meant when greed collides with human life. For Elias, the ending was silence. Behind bars, stripped of power, he never admitted guilt, never offered apology. His name, once carried with authority in Soda Springs, became shorthand for recklessness. a warning rather than an achievement. His empire dissolved, his influence evaporated. The man who had mocked regulators and ordered workers into danger was remembered not for what he built, but for what he destroyed. He had chased profit, but his legacy was prison. For Scott, the ending was different. His body bore the scars of cyanide. His mind struggled against seizures. His dreams of a normal life were stolen. And yet, in every smile, every squeeze of his hand, every moment of connection with his family and fiancée, he remained more human, more whole, than the man who had put him in that tank. Scott's story became a shield for others, a reason for workers to demand safety, a precedent for regulators to enforce laws, a symbol for prosecutors proving that environmental crime was no longer invisible. Though his life was broken, his suffering was not wasted. It became protection for countless strangers he would never meet. For the Dominguez family, the ending was endurance. Day after day, year after year, they carried Scott forward. They bore the weight of caregiving, the financial strain, the grief of what might have been. And still, they loved, they fought, they refused to let him become invisible. Theirs was a victory not measured in verdicts or headlines, but in resilience, in refusing to let Elias's cruelty be the final word. And for the nation, the ending was a new understanding, that environmental crimes are not distant or abstract. They are not just about rivers and forests, though those matter deeply. They are about people, about fathers and sons, daughters and mothers, about workers who deserve to come home alive at the end of the day. The Elias case drew that line in bold, unforgiving ink. It declared that knowingly endangering life is not regulation, but crime. Not a fine, but a felony. Not a mistake, but a betrayal. In the end, the Cyanide Canary sang louder than anyone expected. Its song carried from a small tank in Idaho to courtrooms, classrooms, boardrooms, and beyond. It warned of danger, demanded accountability, and left behind a legacy that still echoes today. Justice does not heal wounds. It does not erase suffering, but it matters. And in the case of Allan Elias, justice spoke. For Scott, for his family, and for every worker who has ever been told to risk their life for someone else's profit. That is the story of the Cyanide Canary. A story of arrogance and tragedy, of resilience and accountability. A story that reminds us all, lives are not expendable.